Hello, everyone, and welcome to this public forum hosted by the UN Food Systems Summit and Action Track 3 on nature positive protection and Action Track 4 on equitable livelihoods. My name is Ruth Richardson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, and I'm also the Chair of the Champions Network for the UN Food Systems Summit. This summit is a global opportunity to shine a light on the centrality of food systems to our collective future. Food systems are so connected to the crises we face, like COVID, climate change, biodiversity loss, chronic disease, on that one hand. On the other hand, food systems are perhaps the best pathway to a better future if we get it right. The title of this event is Resilience and Recovery, Transforming Food Systems for an Equitable and Secure Future for People and Nature. There are a lot of key words in this title, no doubt chosen very carefully. People, nature, secure, equitable, resilient, recovery. They are all connected, of course. We can't have resilience without equity. We can't recover without nature. People are central to a secure future. So thank you for joining us today to dive into what proves to be an illuminating discussion with a few amazing panelists bringing forward perspectives, especially from Indigenous peoples, women, and agroecology. First, I would like to introduce Christine Campo. Christine is Senior Advisor, Food Systems at CARE, and Deputy for Michelle Nunn, who is the Chair of Action Track 4 on Equitable Livelihoods. So Christine, please, could you go ahead and provide some introductory remarks? You have 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Ruth, and happy to be on a panel with Zhao, who I work so closely with on a regular basis in Action Track 3. Action Track 4 is about people and equity. A few months ago, it was estimated that over half the world's 3.3 billion global workforce were at risk of losing their jobs and their livelihoods. Borders were closed, trade was restricted, confinement measures prevented farmers from accessing markets. They had no way to buy their inputs, no way to sell their produce. Many people lost their source of income, and many returned to their villages. The pandemic exposed existing inequalities and worsened the conditions for the most marginalized people of our world: small-scale food producers, farmers, fisherfolk, Indigenous people, seasonal and migrant workers. These are the most underpaid and poorly represented, poorly protected, and exploited people around the world. They have no social protection, no access to health care, no stable incomes to provide for themselves and their families. So the last couple of months, all of our discussions in Action Track 4 are about fairness, access, rights, and justice. And thanks to you, we've received thousands of solutions on how to improve these livelihoods. We've clustered them under 3 action areas. One is on rebalancing agency within food systems. So it's about ways that the underrepresented can be empowered and assembled to increase their bargaining power and demand for justice and equality. The second is about eliminating worker exploitation and ensuring decent work, which is about the enabling conditions for living incomes so that people can thrive with dignity. And the third and last is about localizing food systems. How do we make supply chains shorter? How do we make public procurement schemes work and territorial approaches work so that the food producer has a greater access to that final profit? So I'm so pleased to be with you in this crowd today. We need you, we need more of your solutions, so please keep them coming. Over to you, Ruth, and thanks again, WWF and CARE, for organizing this event.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christine, and really appreciate all the very hard work you have been doing with your leadership team, particularly around these absolutely critical issues. Words like dignity, justice stand out from your comments, so thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce João Campari. João is the leader of the Global Food Practice for WWF, World Wildlife Fund International, also the chair of Action Track 3 on nature positive production. So João, please go ahead.
Delighted to be here, Ruth. Hi, Christine. Good to see you too. The overarching goal of Action Track 3 is to boost nature positive production to ensure the fundamental human right to healthy and nutritious food within planetary boundaries. While the food system provides jobs for more than 1 billion people, and its evolution has allowed us to feed growing populations over time, today it is not supporting a healthy planet. The food system has become the biggest driver of deforestation and of biodiversity loss on land and water, and accounts for about 29% of all greenhouse gas emissions. All while a third of all food produced is never eaten because it is either lost in the fields and in the post-harvest, or because it is wasted when it reaches distribution channels, supermarkets, or kitchens, including our own. And we can't even say that there is a trade-off between human health and environmental health. Since over 900 million people are suffering from chronic hunger today, this is 11.5% of all people on the planet, while 2 billion are either overweight or obese, and this is about 25.6% of all people on the planet. All the impacts of the food system on nature and people have a cost that are generally not incorporated into the price of food. If we were to consider all these hidden costs, they would amount to approximately $12 trillion per year, while the market value of the system is $10 trillion per year. So all told, the net market value of our food system is minus $2 trillion per year. We cannot continue on this trajectory. We only have 9 harvests left to turn things around and deliver sustainable development goals in 2030. For too long, we have extracted from nature to produce food, but there are ways to produce food in harmony with nature and provide enough healthy and nutritious food for all. Scaling these solutions is what Action Track 3 is all about. To do so, we are looking at 3 action areas. First, protecting natural ecosystems from conversion and degradation. Second, sustainably managing existing food production systems for people and for nature together. And third, restoring degraded ecosystems and rehabilitating soil function. All 5 action tracks in the summit are integrating our proposed game-changing solutions. We are working especially closely with CARE on Action Track 4, as Christine just described, to bring nature-positive production with advancing equitable livelihoods. The solutions that overlap and converge the most highlight the importance of the rights of small producer farmers, especially women, to land, water, natural resources, and market access. Second, indigenous people's rights to their lands, as well as the value of their traditional knowledge and role as guardians of nature. And advancing agroecology and regenerative agricultural practices at scale and driving their widespread adoption. Both action tracks are working closely with Action Track 5 as well to enhance the resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks, and stresses. Last year, 40.5 million people were displaced from their homes, which severely impacted their livelihoods. Of this total, 30.7 million were displaced by disasters due to climate change, such as storms and floods. This is just one example of how nature, livelihoods, and resilience are interconnected. It also exemplifies the challenges ahead of us that we aim to work very hard to help resolve, always in partnership with all of you. We are really looking forward to having this conversation today with Ruth and the panelists to explore how these particular themes can drive food systems into the future that we really want and need. One of a healthy planet and healthy people. But before we dive into the discussions, I'd like to introduce a short video from Tanzania that lets us hear directly from some female small-scale farmers about their experiences. Thank you very much.
Tulikuwa tunakata sana miti kwa sababu tulikuwa tunaamini kama kila mwaka ukate shamba jipya ndipo upate ufuta. Kwamba mwaka huu umelima kama hapo umeshakata miti, umechoma, umepanda ufuta, kwa hiyo hapa ulipolima mwaka huu hapafai tena. Unaenda kukata tena miti sehemu nyingine.
Hiki ndio kilimo chetu cha mazoea ambacho tulikuwa tunalima miaka ya nyuma. Kilimo hiki kilikuwa kinatupelekea mapato magumu na umekuwa mfupi, haujapanda kikimo kwamba utakuwa na afya.
Kilimo hiki hifadhi, shina na shina kuna nafasi, na ndio maana utakuta mmea unakuwa na matawi. Hasa hii imebanana, haina matawi. Ulio wote ndio huo unanyooka tu.
Kilimo hifadhi sisi kimetuletea tija kwamba mazao yamepelekea yamependeza kama hivi unavyoona, yametia kwa wingi matawi, kwa maana kilimo hifadhi sisi tumejifunza kuachana na kilimo cha kuhamahama ambacho tunapoteza rutuba kwa ajili ya kukatakata miti ovyo.
Fantastic. Well, I just want to go back to Zhao and say thank you for those comments and for all the work that Action Track 3 has been doing. I really appreciate the pointing to the problem, deforestation, waste. We have many, many other issues with the food systems as a contributor to the crises we face. But thankfully, Zhao started to point us towards what the elements are to get it right. If we have 9 harvests left, how do we get this right over those 9 harvests? Joao pointed to women's empowerment, indigenous peoples as guardians, agroecology at scale, all building resilience, diversity, and equity. So leading from that, I'd like to now introduce you to our amazing panel, 4 people with very deep experience and expertise from different corners of the world. First, we have Jemima Njuki, who is Director for Africa of IFPRI, which is the International Food Policy Research Institute. Jemima is also the gender lead for the UN Food Systems Summit. Next, we have Frang Roy. Frang is the coordinator of the Indigenous Partnership for Agrobiodiversity and Food Sovereignty. He is also part of the Action Track 4 leadership group. Third, we have Susan Chomba. Susan is the director of Vital Landscapes, World Resources Institute, and she is part of the leadership group of Action Track 3. And we have Francisco Rosado May, who is rector and president of the Universidad Intercultural Maya de Quintana Roo. Welcome to all of you, and what a pleasure it is to be here on this panel with you. Let me start with you, Jemima. You've worked for more than 20 years on gender equality and women's empowerment. How do women's rights contribute to an equitable and a sustainable food system?
Thank you so much, Ruth, and it's such a pleasure for me to be here. First, I'll start by saying just achieving gender equality and ensuring women's rights are protected results in 2 huge things. First, from a food systems perspective on improved food security and nutrition, but also, understanding that women's rights are human rights, and therefore protecting women's rights actually ensures that women live lives of dignity, which is very important. From a food systems perspective, we know that women are key actors in our food systems. They're producing food, they're working as wage workers in companies, in farms, they're processors, transforming our food, they are traders, they are consumers, they are scientists, like the 2 of us that are in this panel and others, many that I know are in the audience, but they are also in policy making. But what I want to say is that women are doing all this with stark gender inequalities that we all know. And these inequalities are both a cause as well as an outcome of unsustainable food systems and just food access, consumption, and production. So if we want to see a food system that actually delivers what we've been talking about, that delivers the healthy foods, that delivers this in a way that we are not extracting from the resources that we have, then gender equality has to be at the center of that all. But we also know women are more vulnerable, both to chronic food and nutrition insecurity, and especially food insecurity that's caused by shocks, whether it's climatic shocks, whether it's illnesses, whether it's disasters, whether it's food prices, and even we've seen that with COVID-19. The last pre-COVID data we had for 2019 showed across all continents the prevalence of food insecurity was highest for women. And with COVID-19, we're going to have to put women at the center of the recovery efforts. So as the custodian for gender equality, we have been working across the different action tracks, including with CARE and with WWF, with a vision for a gender-just, transformative, and equitable food system. So those words that you said earlier on, Ruth, I would like to add two more: gender justice and transformative food systems. And we are thinking of a gender-just and transformative food system as one that actually guarantees a world without hunger, but also where roles, responsibilities, opportunities, and choices are available to women and men and are not predetermined by restrictive gender roles. One where countries, communities, women, like we have seen in the video, they are actually equipped to produce enough food with technologies, with information, with rights to land, and can participate in markets as well. So based on the evidence that we are focusing on 4 key areas: strengthening women's voice and agency so that they can contribute to policy decisions, ensuring women like those from Tanzania have access to resources, whether it's water, land, information on improved technologies, social protection, and other services so that they can benefit and control the benefits from their work. The third area is on addressing harmful social gender norms, including engaging men and boys. And finally, changing policies to make sure that policies and institutions are actually working for women. Back to you, Ruth.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jemima. So much more I want to ask you, but maybe we'll get back into some of the details as we get into the Q&A, but very much appreciate your focus on gender justice. Also want to underline your comments about a transformative system. I think part of the Food System Summit is to move away from incremental change and status quo and really embrace what is transformative in the true sense of that word. So very much appreciate you underlining that phrase. Both Action Track 3 and Action Track 4 have affirmed the need to protect and uphold Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights to management to the territories and natural resources for our future of food. I'd like to turn now to Frang Roy. Frang, how do Indigenous peoples' natural resource rights and management contribute to an equitable and sustainable food system?
Thank you, Ruth. It's a pleasure to be here. The diverse food systems of the 470 million Indigenous peoples have often been branded as backward and even problematic. Yet Indigenous peoples preserve 80% of the remaining biodiversity of the world. According to a 2015 study of the Rights and Resources Group, the stewardship of the world's natural resources by Indigenous peoples and rural community-based societies support as many as 1.5 billion people with food, nutrition, water, fuelwood, and other essentials. Studies also undertaken by FAO and McGill University have also shown that these diverse food systems are in fact productive, equitable, and sustainable, and in some cases may have already achieved zero hunger for some Indigenous communities. To Indigenous peoples, their collective rights to natural resources is the one indispensable instrument for evolving equitable and sustainable food systems. I come from a matriarchal Indigenous community of Northeast India, where the children belong to the mother's clan, and the youngest daughter inherits all the clan's natural resources. She becomes the custodian of the clan's property, but with social protection responsibility for all clan members. At the community level, agricultural land is allocated to every household according to needs. Forest areas are earmarked to meet fuelwood needs of the community, and sacred forests are protected to provide ecosystem services. But these equitable food systems are being disturbed by the modern day scramble for lands, for extractive industries, for hydro projects, for commercial agriculture, particularly in many countries where no formal recognition of collective rights and tenure, leading to forced migration, displacement, loss of biodiversity, and unfortunately, militarization of indigenous territories. The good news is that we organize a fellowship program at the Indigenous Partnership, and we have seen that there is a significant group of young indigenous youth around the world who are still deeply and profoundly connected to their lands. They want to defend their food systems, not by combat, but through networking. But they simply cannot save their food systems on their own. They need local and global leadership skills, ability to connect previously disconnected indigenous peoples, and skills to make best use of the knowledge system. Action Track 4 has therefore curated an Indigenous Food Systems Trust Fund for the protection and advancement of knowledge of Indigenous food systems. And we will try to pilot a program with some Indigenous youth and elders and women of some matriarchal communities to identify with them possible initiatives and to demonstrate that it is a low-cost, high-benefit investment. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Frang. I really appreciate you bringing a very vivid story of your own community. So thank you for that personal touch. I also really appreciate you bringing up the issue of Indigenous knowledge. We know that knowledge is so important, and we know that we need to look to diverse evidence to help lead us on this path. And so I really appreciate you elevating that. We know the importance of scientific knowledge and scientific evidence, but also need to hold that together with Indigenous knowledge. So thank you very much. Very happy to bring in another voice by video right now. Here you will hear from Sarah Ngairo, who is a small-scale farmer from Lugoda, Lutali village in Tanzania. Let's hear from Sarah.
Ndiyo, kwa kweli 2006 kulikuwa kuna maji kabisa. Tunavyoanza kulikuwa kuna maji kabisa. Migogoro ilikuwepo mingi. Kulikuwa ipo na kilimo cha umwagiliaji huko, tunaita vinyunguni. Sasa ukifika kule watu wanavyoanza kugombana kuhusiana na maji, anayetangulia ile asubuhi anaenda kuzuia maji. Kwa hiyo yule anayeenda saa 2 saa 3 hakuti maji. Na maeneo haya tuliyosimama palikuwa hakuna maji kabisa. Watu walikuwa wanagombana. Kwa hiyo watu akiweka ndoo pale, anakuja wa pili, anakuja wa tatu, atakayetokea huko anaingia pale kuchota maji, ametoka huko, ni ugomvi unaanza pale kisimani. Unaona?
Haya yalikuwa ni maji kwa ajili ya
kutumia nyumbani. Matumizi ya nyumbani. Kwa hiyo ukienda huko vinyunguni kulikuwa na ugomvi wa wakulima. Ukienda huko utakuta kuna ugomvi kati ya sisi tunaanza kugombana na wakulima tena, tunaanza kugombana na wachungaji tena. Tena huko kwa kuna ugomvi kati ya wakulima na wachungaji huko. Unaona? Kwa hiyo kulikuwa na ugomvi mkubwa sana kwa kipindi wakati tunaanza. Kulikuwa na ugomvi mkubwa sana. Lakini tunamshukuru Mungu, watu walielewa. Mpaka hivi saa hizi tunashirikiana, tupo pamoja.
Fantastic. Really important issues being raised in that video. We know from Action Track 5 the importance of peace. And we see in that video that often food systems, resource scarcity is at the base of conflict, base of the fighting that she's talking about. And so another issue to bring in terms of where food systems can lead us to in terms of being a more secure future. So very much appreciate the voice in the video. I'd like to turn now to Susan. Susan, you have been leading work on forests, food, and water and livelihoods in Africa. And in fact, you were named one of 16 women restoring the earth in 2021 by Global Landscapes Forum. Congratulations, by the way. How do community natural resource rights and management contribute to a more positive future of food, as well as to sustainability and equity?
Thank you so much for having me. And I'd like just to pick my points from the video there and just try to dissect a little bit about property rights based on Sarah's story. So you see different kind of claimants of rights in that short story, where you have some rights of withdrawal, where there's some participants have the right to enter into a physical space, whether it's a well, a water stream, or land, and be able to extract products or services from that resource. And the second kind of resource rights that I'd like to mention is the right of management. And so we didn't get a very clear picture from Sarah's story there, who manages these resources. And that implies that the people who are managing the resources might be able to exclude and allow other persons to be able to use the resource. With that kind of resource right, I'd like to highlight here is the right of exclusion, where again, you can have some claimants into a resource, but they are not allowed to be able to use the resource. And the last one is the right of alienation. And this right of alienation we see is the resource right that does allow the sale or lease or the other kind of rights. So resource rights are broad, because when we talk about resource rights, a lot of people think of it about tenure rights, but tenure rights is just one class of resource rights. Now, I come from the continent of Africa, where a majority of food is produced by smallholder farmers like Sarah and others that you've seen in the video. And these are people who are really, really constrained in terms of resource rights. Either they don't have secure and strong rights to land or tenure rights, or even when they are there, sometimes the land is too small. And therefore, what you've seen is a narrative of smallholder farmers being drivers of land degradation. How can food systems be able to really enhance the power of smallholder farmers across the African continent and the rest of the developing world to be able to really contribute to equitable and sustainable outcomes? I'd like to offer 3 key areas that can be done. And that, of course, is the strengthening and making sure that property rights, and that includes tenure rights, are clear and secure and that they are equitable. And the second one is to ensure that the rights, and especially of marginalized groups, again, we don't want to assume that all smallholder farmers fall into the same category. We just had very key, strong points there from Dr. Jemima talking about the rights of women. And so even within smallholder groups, you have other disenfranchised groups like women, indigenous groups, or other groups that only have customary access, and these customary rights are not really recognized and protected by law. So the UN food systems, as we are thinking about transforming the food systems, we cannot do that without really looking at resource rights and ensuring that we are making sure that they are secure for smallholder farmers, and that we are allocating equitable access and use to marginalized and disenfranchised groups. And last but not least is the aspect of voice and representation. Again, it's very important to ensure that the UN food systems have got representatives of these kind of groups within societies, so that their needs and aspirations are brought forward and taken care of as we look at how to transform our food systems. So that's how I'd like to expand the concept of resource rights and how they relate to smallholder farmers' production, and how we can be able to make the UN food systems more equitable and sustainable in terms of outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Very, very important points, and a really nice build on to what Jemima and Frank have both shared with us. And I just want to appreciate your providing some differentiation of the groups that we're talking about. We often lump these groups together. We talk about women, youth, indigenous peoples, marginalized populations. And we know that while all those communities are incredibly important, that they're very distinct and different. Even within those categories, there's a lot of distinction. So thank you very much for highlighting that. We're going to bring in another voice on video, this time from Mexico. In this video, you're going to hear from Doña Andrea, a member of the Yucatec Maya community of Benito Juarez and a participant in the land system in Quintana Roo in Mexico. Please, if we could roll the video, thank you.
Pues veía que lo hace mi mamá cuando estaba chica, sembraba ella. Pues a mí me gustó. Y empecé a sembrar también. Pues ella busca un poco de dinero.
Ajá.
Sí.
¿Y usted aprendió con su mamá?
Sí.
¿Su papá también?
También él trabaja. Vamos a la misma, todo hay para comer.
Todo hay para comer.
Sí. Mi esposo es ejidatario, pero como te digo que robaron esas cosas donde riegan, porque de antes sembraban sandías, Muchas cosas siembran. Pero cuando lo robaron, pues dejaron de trabajar. Pues, ahora poco, como 3 años, porque sembraba en pepinos, calabacitas.
¿Y usted le enseña a su hija?
Sí, pero ella casi no le gusta.
Ah.
Me dice, ¿por qué no lo dejas? Me dice, te cansas mucho, me dice. Pero a mí me gusta sembrar.
Fantastic. Francisco, you have been deeply involved in agroecology for decades, including a focus on culture and ways of constructing knowledge. You are also the one who interviewed Doña Andrea, I believe. Could you please comment on what Doña Andrea told you and reflect on how agroecology can advance the realization of local indigenous community rights?
Thank you, Ruth. Hi, everyone. Doña Andrea made very important points. Her comments agree with most Yucatec Maya. A, she loves farming. Farming is a way of life. B, she learned farming from her parents, including the love of farming. At the center of her farming is the milpa, which is the most sophisticated traditional sustainable food system developed by the Maya, based on slash and burn, crop rotation, high diversity, and fallow periods. A good milpa means good livelihood. We have everything to eat. We need to feed ourselves from our milpa, Doña Andrea said. Land ownership is important. Her husband was an ejidatario. An ejidatario is a man or a woman who can farm a piece of land, and although he or she does not own the land, he or she is very confident that no one else will dispute the land he or she is working on. Ejidatarios can organize themselves to participate in a large farm, forestry, fish, or conservation project. However, in the late 1990s, the Mexican government amended the constitution. Now, ejido land can be privatized. Interestingly, in my home state and in many states in Mexico, most ejidos where indigenous peoples live have not adopted the model of privatizing their ejido land. Doña Andrea's husband used to grow crops for commercial purposes, such as watermelon. These crops demand lots of water. So with the help of the government, they drill a well and install a pump. Unfortunately, the pump was stolen, so they stopped farming commercial crops in large areas. This is bad governance. Community farmers do not worry about land tenure, but the crops are being robbed. Government does not have these crimes controlled. Doña Andrea was sad when she said that her daughter still doesn't show interest for farming. She is not alone in this major concern. Throughout all Maya peoples, the rate of losing their knowledge on farming, traditional knowledge, is increasing rapidly. It is very sad indeed. Agroecology, which has been acknowledged by FAO, many scientists and organizations as the best alternative to design sustainable food systems, was born and still feeds on traditional knowledge. During the COVID-19 pandemics in Mexico, 2020, the economy rested on two premises. The first one was that people, especially indigenous peoples and local communities, would produce enough to feed themselves. The second one was that conventional agriculture will not stop. These premises were correct, but there was a high cost. In 2021, Mexico will not produce as much food as expected. The food production worldwide is showing a decline, and the price of basic grains is going up. At the same time, there is pressure on the environment, which urges conventional agriculture to convert to a more sustainable mode. It is in this context that Doña Andrea's words come to my mind. It is time to build bridges between cultures, including their ways of constructing knowledge. It is time to promote the interaction of scientists with indigenous knowledge in a more efficient way if we are to design and manage new sustainable food systems. It is time to interculturally co-create knowledge. We all need it. We all deserve it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francisco. Very important points. I want to elevate two things that you've said. One is the point that I think Fran made as well, the importance of indigenous knowledge and bringing that together with scientific knowledge. So there's a whole area there we could explore. The other thing is you didn't dig into it, but you did mention good governance, which is very much a part of this. And I think it's implicit in everything that all of you have been saying around rights and justice and equitable food systems. And so another topic we could definitely explore, given the centrality of governance to the way our food systems evolve. Before we dive into another question for the panel, I just want to mention to all the listeners that you are able to send questions in. Please do so if you have questions of the panel, and I will be receiving those by text, so we'll present them to the panelists at the appropriate time, but please feel free to send in your questions. Before we get to the question and answer part of the agenda, I have a question for all of you. Essentially, the question is, how do these issues interact and come together? You've touched on so many different important elements of food system transformation, from natural resource rights to gender rights, to equality, to access, to governance. How do these issues come together? And can you place your responses in the context of the systems that you're most familiar with? You're all from different parts of the world. And so it's important to understand where you're coming from in terms of your own experience. Finally, just to add to the question, to make it a little bit more complex for you, what are the synergies we should be looking for? And what are the trade-offs that we should seek to mitigate as we bring all these various issues together? So I'm just going to go around as I see you on my screen, and maybe if you could provide some reflections on the questions, that would be fantastic. Susan, can I start with you, please?
Thank you so much, Ruth. Now, I've been working, as you mentioned, in the landscape of land restoration. And what we see in terms of land restoration, one of the key things that we really noted when we started, restoring land with the different African countries was that at the local level, really the aspect of insecure rights really overlapped with the rights of women and also the rights of indigenous groups. So for instance, in Africa, I was working in the Sahel, and really, you find that there's a very big overlap in terms of property rights, gender rights, and rights to trees. And when those ones are not clear and they are not secure, then the incentive for local communities to invest in land restoration became very, very small. And that also applies to change when we want to transform food systems. So you're talking about aspects like agroecological transitions, which do take some time. If you're transitioning from a high-intensive input system into a more agroecological input system, then you're really looking at a long-term investment by farmers. And for that, when there's no secure rights, people, even whether men or women or youth, then there's very, very a small incentive to be able to invest in that kind of a transformative approach. So I would say that they're interconnected. And in terms of the trade-offs, where I see trade-offs, obviously, it's where when you're trying to secure these rights and to clarify, sometimes what we've seen on the African continent is some of the forms of rights that are considered secure, such as privatization, do sometimes lock out some genuine claimants from the resources. And this can be very difficult, especially when societies are coming from a common property rights regime, and then you're trying to make those rights secure, so you go the privatization way, and sometimes people are excluded. And that means that then you're trying to secure the rights of smallholder farmers, of women, but by privatization, you end up excluding some. And that means that you're also breaking some of the traditional structures that do enhance a common pool use of resources. And that can be very, very difficult to deal with. And I think for the food systems, what I'd like to say is, of course, each context that we are operating in under the UN food systems will differ, and we'll need to really analyze and understand the local context. And if there are any kind of decisions that are being made, that those decisions are made together with the people that are affected, with the local communities, with the involvement of women and other groups. And with that, we are probably likely to come up with transformative approaches that are not top-driven, but bottom-up in terms of trying to solve our problems.
Fantastic. Thank you, Susan. Very interesting how you've made those connections, and really like how you talked about the top down, bottom up, because I think that's a big part of the dynamic here. Frank, can I turn to you and ask you about how all this comes together, synergies, trade-offs? What do you think?
Thank you, Ruth. In the Action Track 4, we have been talking a lot about rights, laws, governance, and sustainability, and therefore about scaling up of nature-positive food production for advancing equitable livelihoods. To me, the synergies we need to pursue is to support the principles, practice, and knowledge systems around agroecology, as Francisco mentioned, and regenerative agriculture. But to do so with a strong acknowledgement that indigenous peoples have taught us that these systems must be driven by the core values of caring and sharing, and of respecting nature and of all creatures, great and small. Another area of synergy is to support the bewildering diversity of nutrition-rich wild foods that we who work with indigenous communities come across on a daily basis. However, while doing so, we must not forget that the equitable and sustainable dimensions of indigenous food system sprung not only because of the guiding values, but because also of local governance. Help us to scale up these local initiatives and thereby strengthen what James Scott once called the art of not being governed. Support our trust funds with your resources, your ideas, and your rewards. And with regards to trade-off, when we try to restore degraded lands or protect endangered resources, we must ensure that there is no displacement or exclusion of communities which have been historically connected with the resources without the free, prior, and informed consent. We must also avoid the trade-off between profit and degradation. And technology promotion must be to sustain sustainable food systems, including indigenous food systems. Thank you, Ruth.
Fantastic. Thanks, Frank, very much. Let's go to Francisco. Francisco, what do you think? How does this come together? What are the trade-offs and the synergies?
Thank you, Ruth. I agree with all my colleagues have mentioned, and I would like to add another dimension to the discussion. Some years ago, Mexico decided to embrace a concept of education which is called intercultural education. We realized that many aspects of our lives are manifestation of our vision of the world, meaning our culture. That is for development and also for agriculture. And this is natural because we live in a multicultural world. So different systems of agriculture are different manifestations of culture. But the dominant one is showing to the world that is facing very difficult situations. And the other, that's the conventional. The other one, the traditional, mainly developed by indigenous peoples, is also facing another challenge. They need to increase their yields because a lot of the knowledge is being lost. So intercultural approach means that we can help create bridges between these groups of cultures which have different elements. Conventional, for instance, has the scientific method. Traditional has thousands of years of experiences or hundreds of years of experiences. If we can combine both of them in an intercultural approach, we can develop new systems that can provide better sustainability and everybody will be benefited. Yes, this is not an easy task because many schools of agriculture are focusing only on one type of agriculture, but it shouldn't be the only type. We can come up with different alternatives if we help, if we create conditions for these knowledges to coexist and co-create knowledge. And to do so, we need, of course, the whole world needs to pay attention to this and provide the funding to do that. And that is why it's critical what Frank Roy mentioned, the creation of a trust fund that can allow all these processes to happen. Everybody will benefit. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Francisco. From high level all the way to a very specific suggestion. Really appreciate that. Jemima, I'm going to turn to you now. What do you think?
I think one of the things that I really see cutting across, and even as I work with the action track leaders, is there's the issue of voice and representation. How do we ensure that those people that depend on food systems, women, indigenous people, how do we put them at the center of what we do? How do we ensure that indigenous people are sharing their indigenous knowledge on transforming our food systems? How do we make sure that the voices of women are percolating through the whole system? Because if you think about it, especially here in Africa, a lot of the labor in food production, in food processing, in trading is provided by women. In some countries, over 50%. But as you go higher in that food system, as you go into decision making, into research, into policy making, those voices start to get lost. So in a way, we are depending on indigenous people to keep our food systems working. We are depending on women to keep our food systems working. We are depending on young people to keep our food systems working, but we are not giving them the voice that they actually need to change these systems in a way that is sustainable. So that's one common thing that I see that we need to do across the whole system. The second one is on making sure that our institutions and the institutions that we build or reform or improve to deal with food systems actually work, and they work for people. Because as I keep saying in a lot of my conversations, we want to fix young people so that they can be interested in food systems and in agriculture. We want to fix women so that they can organize. Whereas what we really need to be fixing is the systems. How do women get access to finance? We need to fix the financial system so that it works for them. In terms of trade-offs, even as we do that, we have to recognize some of the unexpected, unanticipated changes that might happen. Thinking of women, the fact that they still bear the burden of unpaid care work. So what does their working in food systems then mean for their burden on unpaid care work? So we have to take a very holistic view to people's lives, even as we think about food systems and how what we do in food systems affects other aspects of their lives, and making sure that we are actually managing those trade-offs.
Wow, so much to think about and to dig into here. I've been asked to try to summarize what you folks have said, which is very, very tricky to do because there's so much richness in the discussion. But let me take a stab at it and see how I do. So first of all, a number of you talked about what's wrong with the current system. I think, Francisco, you talked about a dominant system that's not working for us. Somebody else talked about extractive systems. So we're starting from that perspective. And I think, Jemima, you made the point that we really have to transform these systems. And I love what you just said about we got to fix the system, not the people. It's the system that needs to work for the people. So I thought that was a fantastic contribution. how do we fix that system? What does it look like? Where are we trying to go with this? I've just tried to pull up some key phrases and words that I think actually that all of you have used. It's very interesting to see the sort of consensus around the language. You've talked about collective rights. You've talked about women's rights. You've talked about Indigenous rights. You've talked about dignity. You've talked about justice, especially gender justice. You've talked a lot about voice and agency and representation. You've talked about access to resources, social protection. We've talked about youth. We've talked about respect for knowledge systems. We've talked about good governance. If anybody knows me, if anybody knows the Global Alliance, you'll know that I'm a big fan of principles. And how I would see all of these is that these are principles that must underlie our food systems. And as I constantly say, principles are not just inspirational words. They are deep values that we have to bring to the work and to the solutions. And they can be a tool that we use to guide each and everything that we do, every solution we unearth, every pathway that we follow. Everything that you've talked about today, I think just reinforces the values and the principles that underlie the Sustainable Development Goals. If we think about leave no one behind, if we think about intergenerational equity, gender equity, if we think about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, if we think about the FAO principles of agroecology, everything that you've talked about reinforces these principles. And I believe that by applying these principles, especially to the outcomes of the Food Systems Summit, that we will be able to get to the protection of human rights, to get to the protection of natural resources, to get to the things like resilience and peace that this world so desperately needs, through building bridges, as Francisco said very eloquently. So that's my very quick attempt to try to summarize some of the main points that I've heard from you. I think if I can just pull up one piece of it to provide a bit of a finer point, if we talk, for instance, about voice and agency, which you just did, Jemima, with such clarity, how do we do that? How do we put these folks at the center? How do we put women at the center? How do we put Indigenous people at the center? And how do we bring that into our deliberations around some of the most effective solutions that will be surfacing over the next couple of months? So I think that's really kind of the nut that we have to crack at the center of all this, is the how. How do we do that? So building from that, let's go to our Q&A. There are sort of questions coming in, which is fantastic. And so I'm going to just pull up my phone here. I think the first thing I want to ask, just as the questions come in, is a question around political will. And this, again, gets back to the how. You know, often I hear people say, we know the solutions, we have them in hand. You know, we keep sort of pulling up the same sorts of things. And the problem is not that we're not creative and that we don't have the solutions, it's that we have a lack of political will. So how do we get at that political will to make change and to really dive into this transformation agenda? Anybody willing to jump in on that question?
I think one of the things I would say, especially working in the Africa region, is that the push for political will also has to come with accountability. One of the things in the region that we have seen work very well is the CAADP framework, and the fact that African governments came together, set themselves an agenda, and every so often they hold themselves accountable to this agenda. So how can what we're talking about, food systems, build on those kinds of processes that already exist in the region? I think that is going to be very important moving forward. How do we, for example, take the Comprehensive Agriculture Development Program in Africa, build in the concepts and other areas around food systems so that it fits within that accountability framework that already exists? We want to do, one of the propositions we've made for gender equality in food systems is an accountability framework for food companies as well and food organizations. How do we get the commitments to gender equality, and how do we support organizations just not in the what to do, but how to do it, whether it's in terms of their leadership teams and how inclusive they should be, the policies that they have within their organizations to make sure that there is equal pay, that there's decent employment for food workers, but also in terms of the work that they do, that work addresses the gender inequalities that we've seen as inherent in the food system, and build an accountability mechanism where they actually hold each other accountable for delivery of those outcomes.
Thanks, Jemima. Fantastic. I don't know if any of you work on fisheries. Sorry, before I go to that question, Frank, I see your hand up. Sorry, please go ahead.
I think this is a very important question. As you know, there's quite a significant number of indigenous community organizations who have decided not to take part in the Food System Summit. And they have a number of issues. But one of the key issues is that, is there a political will, really? And I feel that one aspect that can be done is to show that we acknowledge that indigenous food systems are important, that their value systems are important for the world at large. There's a lot of very nice things being said about indigenous peoples, but when it comes to action, we do not see as much. And we want to demonstrate this time. And I take part, Francisco and others, because we want that to happen. That is the acknowledge, and let's make it a statement that indigenous food systems matter, and that will help us to carry forward. And I think the whole world will benefit from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Very much appreciate that. I see everybody wants to jump in on this question. Okay, Francisco, I see your hand up, and then Susan, please. Francisco and then Susan.
Thank you. I would say that not only to consider that indigenous food systems matter, and not only that recognition, but also recognizing that there is a lot in those indigenous food systems that can offer ideas, methodologies, and even test new concepts for the development of sustainable food systems. If we can have a condition to do that, then we actually are sending a strong message to everybody that the narrative is inclusive. Thank you.
Great. So I'm just madly scribbling away here, capturing all this. Susan, please, your addition.
Yeah, I'd like to address the aspect of political will from a political dimension. I think what we see currently, and I'm sure this is not unique to Africa, is that we have no shortage in terms of policies and institutions that are supposed to be driving transformation on the ground. But I think one of the key things that really is missing is to understand what are the key challenges that each of these actors will find important for them to plug into the food systems. So for instance, if we are thinking about transformation of smallholder farmers, we have to understand first what's the key problem there. And the key problem you've seen in African agricultural systems is declining, consistently low productivity. And therefore you still have huge millions of people who are still really suffering from food insecurity and undernutrition, undernourishment. And so if we are thinking about transforming food systems without understanding that that's the core problem that we are trying to solve, then it doesn't resonate with the same people who are supposed to help us drive this kind of change. And so in our work, under Vital Landscapes in WRI, we are thinking about two particular aspects of the food systems that maybe I can share in this forum. And so it's on the production. And so it's really for smallholder farmers in Africa, we have to figure out ways of increasing productivity while still protecting the natural resource base so that agriculture transforms from being a key driver of resource degradation to one that is sustainably produced within the current farmlands without driving natural resource loss. And so if we can be able to come up with practices and policies that do support that, then you will see political will that is driven not just from the top, but also from the bottom. And the second one is really on aspect of prosper. And so there's no transformation that is going to really get a lot of political will if it does not envision an aspect of prosperity of local communities. And this now looks at the whole value chain of the food, from production to value addition to marketing. And this is where we need to see what are the resources that we can be able to provide smallholder farmers with to be able to have that kind of transformation, not just from the production side, from the value addition, as well as from the trade, and ensure that they are getting decent returns from the agriculture sector. And so, without really overemphasizing this point, that also recognizing the African farmers, most of them are really caught up as price takers and not price setters. We are really operating in a global political economy where the smallholder farmers, in most cases, were producing crops like cocoa, crops like shea, and other products that we do export, are not really, they don't set the prices, they are price takers. And this needs to change. So the food systems need to change from the production to the value addition, to the value chain aspects, as well as the global trade. And that way you'll see a lot of political will in terms of transforming food systems bottom up.
Great. So underscoring the systems part of food systems, that it's not just production, but we really have to look at all aspects from a systemic perspective. I'm going to read 3 questions, and I'm going to read these 3 questions in part because I think it's important to know what questions are being asked and to hear the questions, and in part because I'd like to turn to you for any responses that you would like to provide. So the first question is from Jessica. Jessica asks this question: 800 million people depend upon small-scale fisheries and aquaculture for their livelihoods. How can we support small-scale fishing communities secure access rights, not just to farmland and water, but also to fisheries? Question number 1. Question number 2 is from Kelechi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Kelechi asks, with massive land grabs and growing conflicts between land users across Africa, how can policies be more effectively designed to drive more sustainable agriculture and more equitable food systems for small-scale farmers? A third question from Monica in South Africa. Monica asks, what practical ways can be used to increase representation and ensure that knowledge from marginalized groups is included in agroecological systems transformation? 3 very interesting questions. So I would like to turn to each of you and see if there are any of those that you'd like to try to provide a response to. Anybody? I'll just look for a hand up. Please, Francisco, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, let's not forget also that fishery happens in a context in which it's not isolated with the inland processes. And yes, agroecology, for instance, is not related as close as to fisheries as it is to agricultural systems. But we have to look at them as 2 systems that are linked, and we usually do not pay attention to this linkage. The same ecological principles that apply to agriculture under agroecology can also be looked at in fishery systems. So let's think about developing a field there similar to agroecology applied to fishery, and not forgetting the link that there is between the 2 systems, inland and coastal areas. For the last question, and I think it's related to the second question, I would like to emphasize again about the idea of co-creating knowledge. And this is different than some scientists think about co-creating knowledge. To some scientists, co-creation means that they somehow interview and get ideas from a farmer, from indigenous person, and from that, they develop a research project. Well, it is part of co-creating knowledge but it's not exploring the full potential of co-creation of knowledge. The way we think of co-creation of knowledge under an intercultural approach means that we have to understand the way the knowledge is constructed, the context in which that knowledge is constructed, take that into account under another approach, which is the scientific method, and come up with ways of developing, creating something new that emerges of the interaction of these two different ways of creating knowledge. And in this emergence, in this synergy, both get credit. Not only the scientists, but also the farmer or the indigenous or the women or the fishermen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Francisco. Frank or Susan, anything you'd like to add? Or sorry, Frank and Jemima. Sorry, I got that out of order. Frank, please go ahead.
I think it's very important what Francisco is saying about co-creation of knowledge and of initiatives. And in the work that we do, we try at the local level to see how local solutions are found by mixing the traditional and contemporary knowledge and contemporary initiatives. But I think, and we all agree, that we are all trying to scale up nature positive production. But I think it's important to also have laws or systems which will make people accountable when some of these systems are breaking down. I'll give an example. In the area that I work, government is trying to push a hydro project in an area of huge biodiversity against the will of people, and in an area which is earthquake prone. Disasters will come, but will we hold them accountable in the years to come? So companies, when they move into these areas with some of their very sexy ideas of how they can improve the world, but when it doesn't happen, we need to hold them accountable, and there must be international laws to ensure that.
Fantastic, thank you, Frank. Jemima, please go ahead.
Very quickly on some practical things to do on voice and representation, because we know that all these groups we're talking about actually are very well organized. If you think about indigenous peoples and their organizations, all the way from local level to national to transnational and even trans-regional. If you think about women, there are networks of women's producers in Africa at continent level. There are associations of women who are working in small agribusinesses, in SMEs, in food systems. But often these associations, these organizations are not always invited to the table. And so we need to be very, very intentional about making sure that the tables, the offices, the conferences, wherever these issues are being discussed, that they are part of it and they are not being co-opted into an agenda that already exists, that they are actually part of defining what the agenda is. The second thing is even what I was talking about earlier, this global food systems 50-50 initiative, where we want to have a commitment to diversity in leadership, diversity in decision making, and actually having organizations, governments make a commitment to that. We usually see in Africa, for example, in agricultural research, where a lot of my work is in, only 1 out of 4 agricultural scientists are women. And the more you get into leadership positions, only 1 in 7. A lot of this is systemic bias, and this is bias that we need to address to make sure that these voices are being heard. It's not that the voices aren't there, we just aren't hearing them, and we just aren't making sure that they are in the spaces where they need to be in terms of decision making.
Great. Thank you so much. Susan, did you have your hand up? We've got half a minute left. Is any final point you would like to make?
Well, it's difficult to make a point on land grabs in 30 seconds, but I'll try that because I think that's a very, very critical question to respond to. One thing is policy, both at national and international level on land grabs. And secondly, really governments taxing externalities that result from industrial kind of land grab agriculture, and really looking at not extracting benefits from smallholder farmers, sort of tilting the scale into the interest and on the side of the smallholder farmers. So again, I can't do justice to that question in 30 seconds, but do feel free to reach out and I can be able to expound more on that.
Fantastic. Well, you did a very good job of at least highlighting some really important points there. So thank you for attempting and for the offer for people to reach out to you. Fantastic. Well, there's so many more questions we could dig into, but time is of the essence and we've got to start to pivot towards the final part of our session today. But if in the first part, the panelists were talking a lot about the issues and the problems and pointing to some of the important values and principles that need to underpin food systems transformation, I would say that the second part in our Q&A really started to highlight some of the solutions. And some of the things I heard from the panelists included things like how you set the table with any meeting or conference that you have, diversity in leadership, taxing externalities, policy reform, certainly an emphasis on accountability mechanisms and laws. Also new concepts. Francisco talked about the conditions to co-create, building a new narrative that is inclusive, and of course the very important issue of funding and resources. So some very practical suggestions in terms of the things that can be done to try to lead us towards equitable and sustainable food systems. So we're now going to pivot to the final part of our session to hear reflections and responses from two leaders who have devoted much of their professional lives to livelihoods and to nature. So joining us now, we have Michelle Nunn, who is the chair of Action Track 4 and president and CEO of CARE USA, supporting millions of the world's most vulnerable people to overcome poverty and social injustice. We also have with us Carter Roberts, president and CEO of World Wildlife Fund, that works to protect the natural resources upon which all life depends. So Michelle and Carter, simply, can you reflect on the discussion we've just had? And Michelle, I'm going to look to you first. Please go ahead.
Ruth, first of all, you did a brilliant job, and nobody could possibly summarize it and synthesize it in a way that you already have. So I will just say thank you to you and for your work, not only today, but also obviously in the broader constellation of the aspirations that have been articulated here, and especially around the UN Food System Summit and your work leading the Champions Network. To Jemima and Frank and Susan and Francisco, we couldn't have had more wonderful, I think, reflections from you that touched upon all of these different themes that are so important, from setting the table and inclusion of women and Indigenous populations and culture, and as Francisco so well said, talking about the bridging capacity between cultures and also knowledge, the restoration and resource rights that Susan so well articulated. So, I think you, in essence, talked about how transformational we need to be as we move forward, and moving from extractive, for instance, to generative, from exploitive to a rights-based approach, from marginalization to inclusion and true agency, and perhaps to pick up on the CARE and WWF partnership, from siloed to integrated. And I think that one of the themes that comes forward as we look at the UN Food System Summit is we have 5 action tracks, but how profoundly and inextricably linked they are. And we can certainly see that between Action Track 3 and Action Track 4, and in fact that none of the goals that we set for ourselves within these frameworks can be accomplished with, for instance, we can't exploit people and expect that that we won't exploit land, and that we have to build upon this platform, I think, of people and planet. And so I think maybe just to say that as we move forward, one of the things that very much is I think in my mind is, how do you take institutions like CARE and WWF that has a 10-year partnership, and how do you going into and then transitioning from the UN Food System Summit really think about how do we translate these principles, as Ruth so well said, to action and to systems change, and to the kind of again, transformation, but lived out in ways that will truly create the change that we've articulated that we want to see in this world. And I think so much of that is around bridging. Francisco talked very eloquently about bridging, and I think that, again, part of what I hope that that organizations like CARE and WWF can do together going forward is bring people together, bring institutions together that might not otherwise work together, but where we know that essentially we can't create productive, equitable food systems that are also sustainable without new and different kinds of alliances and partnerships. So with that, let me just say that I'm really pleased and grateful to have the opportunity to partner with Carter, and I'm looking forward to his reflections about how we kind of take the wisdom that we've heard and translate that into action.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michelle. Carter, how about for you? What came up from the discussion, and what insights are you taking away?
Oh, it's terrible following Michelle, but I'll just say I did marvel throughout, Ruth, at the job that you did in facilitating such a interesting discussion that was grounded in the reality of place and the stories of people's lives, but also combined that with real hard skills, intelligence, and research on the things that we need to deliver solutions that put people first in these communities. I wanted to also thank Susan, Prang, Francisco, and Jemima for your great stories, your great reflections. I'm going to ask for a copy of a summary and of all the proceedings, because I couldn't take notes fast enough. But it was a lot to digest, and it was inspiring. When I think about this discussion, I think about it in the context of our work at WWF, which is to build a future in which people and nature both flourish. And I think about a question that people often ask me, which is, what do you worry about the most? And surely they think that I'm going to answer climate change is what I worry about the most. But actually, what I worry about the most is running out of planet. I worry about that is our economies and our industries and the broader needs of people in an unsustainable way are chewing up the planet, and that we desperately need more sustainable approaches to not only the production of energy and the creation of goods, but most particularly in the production of food, because it lies at the heart of resource use, the provision of nutrition, and the ability of communities to sustain themselves over the long run. Listening to all the voices on this panel, I'm struck by a foundational truth in our work, which is this: the most marginalized people and individuals in communities and in nations are often and more frequently the very best stewards of biodiversity and of landscapes, and any solution has to rest in their hands. A recent study co-authored by WWF's chief scientist, Rebecca Shaw, found that indigenous peoples and local communities for centuries have been the most effective stewards of nature, and that most biodiversity loss has actually been caused by the appropriations, colonization and intensifies use of land that originally belonged to those communities. We are working at WWF and with partners like CARE on multiple fronts to reverse that trend. But what I also heard from this panel is it's not enough to make sure that the voice of those communities are heard, but that they have a real seat at the table, real rights to their land and territories, and real power to determine their own future. And that matters now more than ever as the US and other governments make commitments toward the SDGs, and also to address climate change, and also to protect 30% of nature by the year 2030. And almost every major scientific publication that talks about these goals shows that indigenous and communal lands are at the very heart of our ability to reach those goals and our ability to keep the planet intact. So my hope is that everyone participating and watching this today will identify one significant thing to incorporate this reality in your work. These themes are now emerging in the Food Systems Summit, and particularly in tracks 3 and 4 that WWF CARE and CARE are working closely on as leaders of those tracks. And I'll just say in closing, Michelle and I have spent a lot of time doing a walkabout with thought leaders in this space and working with our team and thinking about the future of our work together. And surely it will rest on addressing the reality of today's discussion in bringing the full weight of our 2 organizations and our partnerships and all the communities we work with to secure those communities' rights to their resources, to deploy sustainable technologies and approaches to their food systems and ecosystems, and to ensure they have a seat on stage, both in the fall and more generally in the world, in determining the goals the world should set into building the futures those communities seek for themselves. So thank you all, and Ruth, thanks for the time.
Thanks so much, Carter. And I really appreciate you raising the issues of colonization and appropriation. I think we talk about extractive sort of food systems, and that those are what needs to change, but rarely do we go back behind that. Why are they extractive? What's the deep history of our food systems? And how do we get to the deep reckoning that all of us have to do in order to move us towards a different system? You talked about what you worry about most. And I'd like to flip that a little bit. At the Global Alliance, we have a project called Beacons of Hope, recognizing the importance of vision, of possibility, and of hope to the transformation agenda. Through this project, we shine a light on where food systems transformation is happening well, where change is happening, in order to give us a sense of the possible. And to keep us optimistic about the kind of change that we can incite as a human species, which we've done over and over and over again. So I guess my final question for both of you is, what gives you hope? And I would encourage you to answer from a personal perspective, because on these things we often talk professionally. I've got my Global Alliance hat on, my UN Food Systems hat on. But in this moment, we have to bring our heart and our souls and our minds to this agenda. So Michelle, what gives you hope?
Well, I think the voices that we've heard have given me a lot of hope. And I think the idea, frankly, of the UN Food Systems Summit and of a table that is truly open and inclusive, and that is calling upon the world to do things differently. Specifically, maybe I'll just call out one voice that I heard today, Frang's voice, that was very specific about, obviously, and Carter articulated this as well as so many others have, the importance of Indigenous knowledge and the examples of land management and of food generation. And he took that that, and he talked about his own personal community and what's working and that example. And then he also pivoted that towards a very specific solution around how do we invest collectively in new ways of working as a system, for instance, through trust funds. So I think that I have a lot of hope, and especially I guess this is a call to action to those who are listening, that this is a opportunity for us all to do things differently. That the 9 harvests that Zhao articulated are before us, and that should give us both a sense of urgency, but also I think the seeds of hope that have been planted today can really blossom into something quite powerful. So I tend towards hope, and I think there's lots of reasons at the end of this conversation to lean into it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michelle. Carter, what about for you? What gives you hope?
Well, you asked me to make it personal, so I can only talk about my kids. What gives me hope is watching them make the choices that they make. All 3 are in college. My youngest son initially talked about majoring in economics because a lot of his friends thought that was the path toward making a lot of money in the future. And he has recently shifted to majoring in the use of quantification and analysis to solve the social problems of the world. It's actually a major at his school. It gives me hope that my daughter, who's devoted her life to creative writing, wants to write about the most marginalized peoples in the world and to bring their voices alive. And what gives me hope is that my oldest son, who just arrived last night from Colorado College to surprise me because today is my birthday, what gives me hope are the things that he talks about. Because when I visited him in school, there were only 2 banners that hung in the big school auditorium. And one was the "We Are Still In" banner about the devotion of every part of American society to stay in the Paris Agreement. And the other banner had 3 words, "Black Lives Matter." And what gives me hope is that my son, my oldest son, is totally devoted right now to 2 issues, which is renewable energy and working with indigenous communities and helping them bring energy to their families and their communities in a way that keeps the planet intact. And it gives me hope that they're all thinking about those things instead of just making their way to Wall Street to make heaps of money. And the incoming generation brings a lot of energy to everything we talked about today.
Thank you, Carter. First of all, happy birthday. It's my son's birthday today, too.
Right.
And obviously, you've been a good parent, but as a parent, we both know that really it's our children that teach us. So thank you for those reflections. Well, it's almost impossible to wrap this up in any coherent way because there's so many important themes, and we've already made an attempt to do that to some extent. This is hosted by Action Track 3, Nature Positive Production, Action Track 4 on equitable livelihoods. And we've seen in live detail how these agendas come together and how important they are to each other. We cannot achieve equitable livelihoods without protecting nature, and we cannot protect nature without thinking about the people, and especially those that are at the center, that are the focal point, and that are at the sharp end of our food systems. Women, youth, Indigenous peoples, recognizing the differences between them, but the centrality of all those communities in this future agenda. So I'm just going to say a few thank yous by way of trying to wrap this up. First of all, Christine and Joao, thank you for helping to organize this and for your leadership with Action Track 3 and Action Track 4. Michelle and Carter, obviously, very much also in leadership roles around the thinking behind these very, very central issues. Thank you for sharing your time and your thoughts with us today. Very much want to thank the panelists, Jemima, Susan, Francisco, and Frang. Absolutely wonderful and an honor to be in conversation with you today. Thank you for sharing your insights, your expertise, and your experience. I want to thank those in the videos. I can't name all the names because there are lots of different voices, but it was really wonderful to be able to bring those voices to this conversation, even through digital form. And so please, if you have any interconnection and interaction with the people that were in the videos, please pass along our thanks. Also want to say thanks to everybody in the background helping to organize this, including the tech team and the organizing team. Many, many thanks for making it run so smoothly. And by proxy, I want to thank all of you for participating and all of those that have been part of Action Track 3, part of Action Track 4, those who have contributed ideas and solutions and important perspectives, especially on the need to elevate voices of women and Indigenous peoples, the centrality of rights and justice, dignity, agroecology to our collective fight for resilience, recovery, equity, security, and a more positive future of food. So thank you all for joining us. A pleasure to be here with you today, and the discussion continues. Please get involved, and we look forward to hearing from you post-event. Many, many thanks.